Expert evidence or junk science? That's the question being asked after a series of high-profile appeals in recent months. They've raised alarming doubts about the use of untested evidence that could put innocent people behind bars. Hollywood crime shows have made forensic evidence all the rage, but in truth it can be dangerously unreliable, as Deborah Cornwall reports.
It's called the CSI effect, the highly seductive notion that forensic science, at least on television, never fails. But in the real world, say the experts, forensic evidence is complex and maddeningly inconclusive, and when used in court, can be dangerously misleading for juries.
Let's magnify it, see if we can get a reflection off her eye.
Okay, magnification times 100 for starters.
When you're talking about stab wound comparisons or shoe marks or photographic comparisons, those sorts of things, it's very sexy evidence. It's the CSI material that people see on their TV screens all the time. The reality is, though, the scientific reality is that much of that evidence is built on foundations of sand.
A recent string of high-profile appeals have exposed a worrying lack of rigour behind much of the forensic evidence heard in our courts.
She is, Lucy flopping. Oh, that was good.
These Mythbusters-style experiments were crucial to the 2008 murder conviction of Sydney man Gordon Wood. Convincing the jury, Wood must have thrown his girlfriend Carolyn Byrne over the gap, Sydney's most notorious suicide spot. But in February this year, the prosecution case collapsed spectacularly when the New South Wales Court of Appeal threw out the expert evidence as critically flawed.
I am not persuaded that Associate Professor Cross's evidence or the experiments which he devised allow a conclusion that Miss Byrne could not have jumped.
In another extraordinary case last November, Victoria Legal Aid successfully challenged the standard X-ray tests that had been used to detain 24 Indonesian boys in adult prisons on people smuggling charges. The wrist X-rays, which have been used for the past 80 years to identify chronological age, were completely discredited in a test case in which a 14 and 17-year-old were found to have been wrongly identified as adults.
This sort of evidence just keeps being called until someone calls it to account, and that just doesn't happen often enough here.
Legal forensic science expert Professor Gary Edmond started observing expert witnesses in New South Wales courts 4 years ago and was shocked by what he found.
And I must say I was scandalised by the quality of the evidence and the claims being made by experts, or so-called experts, who didn't know whether they could actually do what they claimed, didn't know how accurate they were.
His observations were reinforced by a 2009 warning from the US National Academy of Sciences that, with the exception of DNA evidence, there was a remarkable lack of reliable research in even the most routine forensic tests, from fingerprinting to blood spatter patterns.
Things like voice comparison evidence, the use of images for identification purposes, some types of prints like footprints and so forth on carpet. There's very little in the way of testing of those practices, and we know very little about their value as evidence.
Forensic facial recognition expert Associate Professor Richard Kemp says Australian courts often fail to distinguish between properly credentialed forensic experts and professionals who simply call themselves experts. He says this is especially common in boom areas like facial and body mapping, used to identify people from CCTV vision and mobile phone images.
We have people from a whole variety of different backgrounds, from backgrounds as different as anatomy or anthropology or satellite imaging even, coming to the table and announcing they're experts. The trouble is that we don't know anything about the reliability or the validity of their evidence.
Phonetics expert Dr. Helen Fraser says voice recognition poses similar challenges. Transcripts of listening devices and phone calls are used every day in court, but transcribers often mishear or even imagine crucial words and phrases.
Help! You're all dead. What's the matter? They're all dead. I came home and they're all dead. Whereabouts are you?
The risks of relying on voice evidence were dramatically illustrated by this emergency call made in 1995 by New Zealand man David Bain, who claimed he'd just returned home to find his 3 siblings and parents shot dead. Bain was sentenced for life over the murders, but was freed after 15 years in jail when a retrial found him innocent. In their new case against Bain, police had sought to rely on a digitally enhanced version of the emergency call in which they insisted Bain could be heard making a confession. The court ruled it inadmissible, but in an experiment to test how the jury might have been influenced by the call, Dr. Fraser played it to a random group of people.
First, we just didn't tell them anything, except a warning that this is a crisis call.
Who's all dead? My family, they're all dead. Hurry up. It's okay. Every street that runs off Somerville Street? Yes.
Most of the group heard nothing incriminating, though several did hear Bain say, "I shot the prick," the very same words police had heard. Once it had been suggested to the group, it was played again. Suddenly 1/3 of the group were convinced they could hear it too.
So the alleged confession was, "I shot the prick." So perhaps if I play it again, you might hear that. So now you hear, "I shot the prick."
I do.
It's not enough just for the judge to say, "Now, jury, be very careful." Sometimes people hear things that aren't really there. The jury think they are being very careful. So once you've heard something, it's very hard to unhear it.
Legal observers say it's hard to gauge the full impact of Australia's low reliability standards, but there's no question we're now lagging well behind similar jurisdictions, especially in the US and England, where the judiciary now demand far more rigorous testing of expert evidence.
Evidence becomes very compelling, very convincing for juries when dressed up in the clothing of an expert witness. But the reality of it is that the emperor's wearing no clothes.
Deborah Cornwall reports.